This video is about the French and Indian War. And to get started, I want you to think about a couple of questions. The first being, how does the French and Indian War change the relationship between Great Britain and its 13 colonies? And is it a little bit? Is it a lot? Is it not at all? That's what to what extent means. And we'll go into it in more detail. Next, I want you to think about how the colonial politics, economics, and culture from 1607 to 1754, our period two, influenced the development of the American independence movement. One really important term that you need to know is the concept of salutary neglect. And this is really a hands-off approach that Britain was taking at the time. And they're really kind of absent in the general day-to-day affairs of the colonies, which allows them to develop on their own. So what was going on in England was obviously the fact that there's this big Atlantic Ocean made a difference as to how much control it could exert, but also they're busy with the English Civil War and then the Glorious Revolution. And the colonies are basically developing their own unique economies. We learned about plantation economies and manufacturing and all that in period two. And there's tremendous economic growth happening. The colonial gross national product, which means that the total values of goods and services produced in a country within a year, is tremendous. And it equates to 1/3 of all of Great Britain's GNP for that an entire year. So they're really producing a lot and they're a valuable commodity. They also have experience with self-government through things like the Virginia House of Burgesses, and they have a higher life expectancy and literacy rates than many of people in England. However, Britain will begin to exert some control before even we get to the French and Indian War. One of the things they've been doing was looking at the Navigation Acts and strengthening those. If you recall, the concept of mercantilism is the idea that a country's value is based on how much wealth it has, and the only way to get more wealth is to have colonies which serve the dual purpose of, on the one hand, providing the natural resources, but also on the other hand, to be able to buy the finished product as the manufacturing. They are setting up vice admiralty courts, which are merchant courts. They don't have juries. They have these perceived corrupt judges by the American colonists. And they're developing mercantilist policies over the colonies through the Board of Trade. In 1733, well before we even get to the French and Indian War, they'd passed the Molasses Act, which was a tax on non-British import of sugar. So if you imported sugar from Britain, you were fine. You had to pay extra money if it was coming from another country. And it was done to limit the trade that people were doing between non-British countries and the colonies. They wanted them strictly to trade with the British because that would help with mercantilism. So a historical context of the French and Indian War is the fact that America is valuable real estate. The French, the British, the Spanish, they all want as much land as possible. So the people that live in Canada as well as America are becoming pawns in a larger chess game. And these are all wars of colonial expansion, but they start in Europe. So we have King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, and they are going to start in Europe and spill over into America. And one of the main areas where this is going to happen is the Ohio River Valley, because they're going to fight over control of that and the fur trade that's going to happen. So the difference with the French and Indian War, which is the fourth of the wars, is the fact that it starts in America as opposed to in Britain. And it's going to be called the 7 Years' War in Europe. It's actually going to last 9 years in America. So what you have is the French. It's not fighting the French and the Indians fighting each other. It's the French and their Native American allies as well versus the British and their American allies. So that's an important thing to know. So in 1754, to give you a little bit more information, there had been an increased population and trade caused by France and Britain. They caused them to seek new territories and markets. And so they wanted this Ohio River Valley. And Britain had established the Ohio Company to develop trade, but France had already claimed land there. So in 1754, the French built Fort Duquesne on the Ohio River, or Ohio River Valley. And they did this as a precautionary move because this was a very important area for the fur trade, which made them a lot of money. It also provided access to the Mississippi River. And there was just a massive amount of land that was available. So this is going to cause the two nations to come into conflict with each other. One of the reasons they built this fort was because the French saw the Iroquois were trading concessions to the British merchants as a threat to their interest in the Ohio River Valley. So they saw that these merchants were potentially going to disrupt their fur trade, and they wanted to get rid of them. And you had some English wealthy planters who owned about 500,000 acres of land. So enter George Washington as this young 22-year-old. He's sent there to tell the French that they're trespassing. But the French had no plan whatsoever to leave. So George Washington is suddenly made he's made an officer and sent back. And this time he's given 150 militia, and they build what's called Fort Necessity. Well, the French, there's going to be fighting that's going to break out, and George Washington will be forced to retreat. And ironically, the surrender is on July 4th of all days. But George Washington, even though he surrenders, is hailed as a hero for taking on that sworn enemy of England. And a fun little fact that you may not be aware of is that George Washington actually started a world war. So he has that to add to his name with all those other lists of accomplishment, is that he single-handedly started a world war. And the way he did this was by the fact that he killed the French commander. And this is what is going to start off this French and Indian War. This is what North America looked like before the war. You can see all the yellow is the British claims, the red is the French claims. And you can see there's a disputed area of red and yellow there. In addition, Spain had basically all of modern day Mexico, the Caribbean, and it looks like Central and South America. And Russia has this tiny little area up there in Alaska. One of the things that happens is what's called the Albany Plan of Union. And Ben Franklin is the one who organizes this. And the idea was to discuss Native American threats and ask for an alliance with the Iroquois. However, the Iroquois will refuse to commit at this point. But the long-range goal is unity and defense. The plan, however, fails because the colonists aren't ready to work together yet, and Britain rejects it because it's just too much independence for the colonists. But it is important because it does become a model for future cooperation. Ben Franklin is also responsible for what is considered the first American political cartoon that was printed called Join or Die. And as you can see here, it has many of the different colonies all carved up. And the idea is that if we don't work together, then potentially we could no longer exist because we have this increasing French concern as well as Native American concerns on the Western frontier. So the British will attempt to invade Canada in 1756. Nearly all of the Native Americans will ally with the French. One exception is the Iroquois. Now, you would think with 90,000 French people versus 1.5 million colonials that they would win. However, the French were far better organized, they were more experienced fighters, and they had more native allies, as I already mentioned. To the native people, the French were seen as the lesser of two evils. So initially, the war is a disaster for the British. But then William Pitt comes in and becomes the leader of the British. He changes the strategy and amasses a 50,000 man army. Fort Duquesne will fall in 1758 at the end of this, and it will be renamed Fort Pitt, which is Pittsburgh today. So if you ever wondered why it's called Pittsburgh, there you go. But he emphasized naval warfare. And one of the stories that came out of that is the fact that the commander, Jeffrey Amherst, apparently gave Native Americans blankets covered with smallpox. This is not the only time that I have heard of this story. I've heard of it also with the Trail of Tears, which we'll get to in period 4. But it certainly is a chemical warfare strategy, basically, that they're using, biological warfare, actually, strategy they're using against the native tribes, and something that is would not be acceptable. Then additionally, another term that you're going to learn about in period 4 is called impressment, which is forcing colonists into the military of the British. And that's going to be happening as well at this time period. So the war ends finally in 1763. This is considered the end of salutary neglect, where the British will start exerting more and more control, and that will be in the next video talking about the road to revolution. But looking at the Treaty of Paris of 1763, we can see that France is going to give up all of its lands in North America. So the English will have all of Canada, the lands east of the Mississippi that were the French lands, not all the way to the Pacific Ocean, because that part is controlled by Spain. But they will also get some land, land west of Mississippi is going to Spain. The British are going to become the naval leader of the world for a very long time. They will be considered the ones to control the oceans. Spain will give up Florida to Britain. However, eventually Spain does get it back because we buy it from them later on in exchange for Cuba and the Philippines, which is another place that we will hear about in period 7. So as you look through here, some of the things that were made as decisions in 1763 will have impact on some of the things we'll talk about later on in period 4, and even later on in the year. So you can see that there's an interweaving of different events, and there's long-term consequences for many of these. So a few other things that happened in 1763. So this is a really important year to know, is that the natives have just lost a very valuable trading partner because the French had been nicer to them. Basically, they had provided them with tokens and all kinds of things. And so the colonists are going to, not only are they losing this trading partner, but now the colonists are going to say, hey, the French are gone, let's move into their territory, which is where the natives are going to be. So the chief Pontiac of the Ottawa is going to create a confederation. This is a loose gathering of tribes to work together, and they're going to proceed to attack forts out on the frontiers, where, as well as other settlements. And they're going to refuse to surrender their lands to the British. Um, there's going to be about 2,000 colonists who are killed or captured, and the rebellion will die out about 18 months in. But this is something that's making the British nervous of the fact that here we just finished a war and now we're having more attacks by the natives because the colonists are moving into the territory. So remember that. The Paxton Boys is another uprising that happens, and this is where the Western Pennsylvania Scots-Irish settlers are going to demand that the colonial government do something about these random attacks by Native Americans. And they consider themselves like a vigilante group where they're going to take matters into their own hands if the government won't. And they march to Pennsylvania. And along the way, they murder all these innocent people. And if you think back to in period 2, we talked about Bacon's Rebellion as well as Leisler's Rebellion. You're going to see some continued examples of this idea that you have these people on the West who are the farmers. They're the poorer individuals that maybe don't have the same lifestyle as those that are in government, or that those are the Eastern elites. And you're going to see these constant conflicts of class between them because they feel like they're not being listened to and they're not getting what the Eastern elites are, that there is this distinguish. So the result is that the British are going to send in a lot of troops, and it's going to help to defeat Pontiac's rebellion. So they are tied a little bit together. Next, we have the Regulators. In 1771, these are, again, frontiersmen that are in North Carolina. They're, again, upset with Eastern corruption and the taxation and everything. So it's going to lead to a battle between the colonial militia and the Regulators, who will eventually lose. But again, it's a showing of this battle of the classes. Probably the most important thing of 1763 that's going to change the relationship between the British and the Americans is this proclamation line. And as I had mentioned previously, we have this problem where Native Americans are living in the land that the colonists now see as the French are gone, it's our land to take. And so it's coming into conflict. So King George will draw this line, and he will forbid any settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, and wants to basically separate the colonists from the Native Americans, let the Native Americans have their land. Of course, the colonists are very angry about this. And they don't understand why this is happening. To the British, they're going to save money because they're not going to have to send in troops to put down all of these rebellions with Native Americans and these problems. So it'll prevent Native American trouble. And remember, they're starting to draw back and get the colonists closer to them. So it will keep the colonists closer to them. Thousands are going to defy and move west anyway. But here you can see the red line is the proclamation line of 1763. So you can see all that land that's now available to the west, and yet they're not allowed to go there. Perhaps you can see some of the beginnings of why the colonists will start getting upset at the British by this. There's two viewpoints coming out of this war. One is the colonists. They're very happy the French are gone. And as I said previously, they want to settle these Western lands. And they feel really proud that they helped win this victory. They didn't like the fact that the British Army did not promote Americans, or they're very few. They were treated very poorly by the British Army, and they did not like that. So that's why they lost respect. But as I said, they have greater confidence. They have now fought bravely in 4 wars that had happened. And really, they expect the idea of this autonomy, this freedom that they'd had to continue. Well, to the British, they're broke. One of the things that you should know about war is it's very expensive. And so all of these 4 wars of fighting have amassed this huge amount of debt that they have to pay. And now they have more land to take care of and less money to do it. So they feel that colonists during the war didn't do enough to support the war. All they did was complain, and they hadn't really performed that well. American shippers had continued to trade with the French in the West Indies, even though they were at war with them. And so they felt that, well, this is going to benefit the colonists. So now it's time for you to pay up. If you're going to be in debt, you need to help us because this ultimately benefits you by getting the French out of the way. And they decide to enforce those navigation acts that I previously mentioned and assume more direct control. And this is what North America looks like after the war. Notice the French are pretty much gone. There's a little tiny bit down there where it says Domingue, which is the only little part in the Caribbean that the French have left. And you can see how much British claim there is. And yet, remember, there's that red line that says you can't move past this. So again, brewing this conflict. So what did happen to the French? Oh, sorry, I have one more picture first. So this shows you the difference. Again, sorry that it's not clear, but you can see that the colors. But so what happened to the French? The British had demanded that the French that remained either swear allegiance to them or they leave. And so this is certainly going to be a challenge because many of the French are going to leave. You had a group called the Acadians who lived in Nova Scotia, which was part of Canada. And then the first to leave, and they go to Louisiana. And so if you ever wondered where the term Cajuns comes from, it's these individuals who moved there. In addition, you still do have in Quebec, in the Canadian province, you do still have French culture and language still very dominant. So there is definitely some lingering results of the French occupation in America. And that brings us back to the end and looking at this question once again. And so hopefully you can see now what extent the French and Indian War changed the relationship between Great Britain and the 13 colonies. And we will be discussing that in one of our live sessions. So take a few moments to kind of jot down some notes as to what you think changed it, and what things changed and what things stayed the same is really how you would answer this kind of an essay question by making a column. Is there anything that stayed the same at all? And is there anything that changed? And that is it. So thank you very much.